Considering the levels of organization that are relevant to the human body, we want to start with the chemical level of organization, which would be the lowest or simplest level from which everything else is composed. When we're considering elements and the atoms that represent those elements, a very powerful tool was developed to standardize our understanding of the elements, called the periodic table of the elements. And it's a very powerful tool because it gives us a lot of information very quickly, both textually and in a representation where you can quickly see relationships between different elements. This is called the periodic table of the elements because the rows across are called periods, and they share particular properties. The columns are referred to as groups, which also refer to elements that share properties. Now, if you look at any particular piece of it up close, any single square, you'll see that there's some particular information present. So feel free to zoom in on any of those squares to look at it a little bit more in depth. There's going to be an abbreviation representing the name of the element. Sometimes the abbreviation doesn't seem to match our common name for it. For instance, sodium is abbreviated Na, and that's because the Latin word for sodium is natrium, so Na is an abbreviation for natrium. There's a number representing the atomic number, the number of protons found in an atom of that element. An atom with a different number of protons is from a different element. The atomic number is just a sort of defining characteristic of atoms. And then there's going to be some additional information present. A lot of that we're not terribly concerned with in this course. It's very useful and very important for a chemist, but we're not going to get hung up on too many of those things. We're not going to refer to the periodic table of elements too often, but keep in mind kind of how it's laid out. It does give us some information that's useful. This figure that I got from the internet highlights a number of different characteristics that the periodic table will give us a representation of. What we're going to be most concerned with here is what's referred to here as electron affinity, or I'll use the term electronegativity also, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But notice how the way that these elements are laid out on the table does in fact give us a glance at how different elements fit into these types of characteristics. And that's one of the very powerful things about how the periodic table of elements is organized. This version of the periodic table is highlighting one property in particular, which is called electronegativity, or electron affinity as the previous representation really described it. How electronegative something is, or what its affinity for electrons is really describing how it interacts with other atoms when it binds. Now, that property, considering the table here, is going to increase as we go up the rows to higher periods and across the columns to higher groups. The most electronegative element is fluorine, which is in essentially the upper left corner. It's right next to oxygen, right above chlorine, and you can see the numbers there. The color coding that we see in this table goes from yellow at very low electron affinities, and red for very high electron affinities. There are a few colors that obviously are a little off. A lot of them don't have a lot to concern us with because they're elements that are going to mostly be toxic to the body. However, notice that hydrogen is a darker shade than lithium that's right below it, and the number there is quite different. Hydrogen's 2.20, lithium's 0.98, while they're right next to each other. And usually when we're looking at squares that are next to each other, they're generally fairly close. The reason for that is that electronegativity basically comes down to two aspects of an electron. The bigger the nucleus, therefore the more protons present, the greater affinity it's going to have for electrons. Remember, protons and electrons are negatively charged, so they're going to be attracted to each other. The more positively charged nucleus, then the greater the attraction to electrons. Also, the shorter distance from the proton to the electrons, or the fewer orbital shells between the protons and the electrons that are joining while an atom is bonding, the greater the electronegativity. So the big jump between lithium and hydrogen is really because lithium has two shells, and that second shell is going to be big enough to potentially hold 8 electrons. And hydrogen only has one shell that can only hold 2 electrons. So really, if you thought about where the hydrogen should be, while it is in group 1, and there's a very good reason for that, as far as electronegativity is concerned, it's going to be a lot closer to carbon. The shade of hydrogen and the shade of carbon, represented by the C in this, are nearly identical. They have pretty close electron affinities, which is actually an important point that we'll talk about later on. Also, I want to point out in this table, those boxes that are grayed out and have no number associated with them don't really make bonds with anything. So helium, neon, argon are inert gases. They don't really interact with other atoms, and so there's just no electronegativity there. And then the row of gray down there at the bottom, again, most likely toxic to the body in any form, but those are a very unusual set of elements that just don't react with others quite the same way because of their properties.